It is the law.
Because it's warmer.
It's apparently cowboy tradition.
Yeah, it's
This
cowboy
is,
tradition. Wearing your bells in the winter, it's
I said
hungry to wear your
lots of
straw,
things,
it's,
yes.
it's tighter, it's.
I feel like winter should take place after.
Sure.
I feel like Labor Day is pushing it.
It's because Labor Day to Memorial,
Do.
and then Memorial Day to
Is that
Labor Day.
like
you
wearing
show
your
this.
white shirt on like the day after Labor Day?
See, I think that's just like.
White,
That's the first I've heard that too.
I
So you
don't know.
can't wear white after Labor Day? Oh, you can't. wear
Right.
white. Yeah. Is that the thing? Google that game.
Okay. All right, 1 o'clock. Onward we go. So, a couple of things. One, yes, I know this says 2023. I changed this. I don't know, apparently I didn't say it. My bad. But it's the red PowerPoint, so you know that. Keep in mind, next Monday, Labor Day, right? So I won't see you then, already in the second week, which I feel like is weird. I feel like we started a week late. More like later than usual, but maybe that's just me. Friday, I'm gonna go over 2 things, to prepare us for upcoming field trips. One of those is I'm going to we're gonna have bear safety later, okay? By the one guy I talked about, he's gonna give you a full bear safety, like rundown and whatnot, but it would be incredibly irresponsible of me to take all of you into Yellowstone and just be like, do you know what kind of bear that is? Maybe, maybe not. Do you know what to do if that is coming at you? Maybe, maybe not, right? So I should probably do that before we get to Yellowstone. So I'm gonna do that on Friday, all right? And then we will also, talk more in depth about like what fitness is, what fecundancy is. Not delve like really deep into reproduction because we're gonna do that later, but I'm gonna give you some ideas of what these things are. Different behaviors that exhibit in different ungulates and so forth. That way, when you are there, you're not just like seeing it for the first time and me telling it to you for the first time, and you're like, what is this? Right? So there's some semblance of an idea. We'll learn a lot while we're there. What I've experienced myself and what has been the experience of pretty much everyone I've always talked to is that you retain more in field trips than you do sitting in here. It's just better. It's just far and away better. So that's why, one reason why we're doing it. The other reason is because we can. And it's third reason is because I want to do it. So we're doing it. So we'll get a lot while we're there and we'll learn it, but it will still be helpful to have some kind of exposure to terminology and what's going on before you get there, right? So keep that in mind. That's what we'll do Friday. But because Labor Day is like the second week, it like shoves weird stuff around in a way because we lose that long day on that Monday. So I'm going to start like the lecture for like chapter 2, 3, and 4 today, and that'll just span across today and then into next week kind of thing. Is what we're gonna do. That way we know we're getting it. It's important stuff to build on in mammalogy. What are these things? And then I'm gonna introduce you to those concepts. P. Cook will tell you more about sauropsids and synapsids, these here. That'll be mid September. That's his research, Dr. P. Cook, that's what he does, but you know, we'll give some kind of like introduction to what these things are. Hopefully by, I would say, the beginning of next week, like when we get here Wednesday, you will have read chapter 1 in its entirety. Okay, chapter 1 is basically what is mammalogy? How do we study mammalogy? What are the different methods to employ, stuff like that. Things like radiotelemetry. If you know what radiotelemetry is, where they take and put a radio signal, a VHF radio signal on an animal. And they walk out there with a giant antenna and then pinpoint their location and find them and stuff. GPS collar, they're another one, right? You can use those, or use on elk and wolves and bears and stuff all the time for stuff like that. GPS coordinates, or harder to outfit on smaller animals just because of their size. The USGS made a mistake of doing that for sage grouse one time. And thought it was a good idea to make it solar powered. And, you know, that's well and good because you don't run out of battery then, right? But someone didn't have enough forethought. What does a solar panel look like up in the air? It's like a mirror, looks like a giant light, like something's going on. So what does an eagle or a hawk see? Oh, that's shiny and different. So a bunch of sage grouse hens just got annihilated because of that. The chapter talks about things like that, right, into problems. It also, I think in there, one of the trap examples is like the trap you have to use to catch a wolverine. You all know what a wolverine is, yeah? What do they look like? Do you know anything about wolverines at all right now? They're part of muscle a day, we'll talk about them. They are fierce. They are a fierce animal. They weigh like 30 to 40, 45 pounds at most. And in order to trap them, normal steel traps don't work because they chew through and break them. Solid steel traps don't work. So instead, they have to take and fell entire full pine trees and cement them together like a log cabin to catch a single wolverine because it will get out of anything else, which I find just incredible. It's the best. Right, and they've also been known, a 45-pound animal to fight off a grizzly bear over a deer carcass. Yeah, it was like a adolescent grizzly bear that had just went off on its own, but still, it was a grizzly bear that weighed like 400 pounds. And this 40-pound animal was like, nah, this is mine. And it won. That happens more often than not, actually. They've also been known to hunt deer just by jumping on their face and then not letting go until the deer gets tired and just vice gripping right on their throat, suffocating them. That's just how they do it. They literally just like hang on. It's wild. They're wild animals. The entire family of muscelidae is just wild. We'll talk about it. Anyone ever see the honey badger video on YouTube? They're a part of muscelidae. That's the same kind of thing. And if you know what a badger is, think of that, but meaner. That's a wolverine. Okay. This week, I'll just back out and go to Canvas. All right. Here we see Canvas. Here's kind of our bear safety stuff. I'll go over some of this on Friday, like I said. Does anyone have bear spray at all? You have, okay, one of us, I think I have extra bear spray at home too. We'll bring just a couple of cans for our field trips. It's exceedingly unlikely that we would ever need it, of course.
I have two, and then I can get more from the other side.
Okay.
I work.
You just like for free, just take them for the time?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. All right, well, then we won't worry about it. You'll bring it. I'm down here. I got this lecture from right here in week 2. And like I said, we're just gonna start it, kind of pace through it, have discussion. It won't be super fast, but we're gonna pace through it. And then next week, I'm also gonna talk about bison in particular. Since our first field trip is about bison, it would be good to know some of the natural history, why bison is important. Bison used to be all over the United States. Like it wasn't just in Yellowstone and like a little tiny fraction of Wyoming and Montana, and then up in Woods National Park in Saskatchewan or Alberta, Canada. Like they used to be over in Pennsylvania and Indiana and Illinois. They were everywhere. There's like massive herds that were millions of bison deep that are just gone. Right? We hunted them and extirpated them from most of the country. You know what extirpated means? Okay. What does extinction mean? Complete end. Right? Do you know the difference between, well, it's in the name, There's extinct, there's two different classifications that the IUCN uses. The first one is extinct in the wild, which is self-explanatory, right? And then there's just extinct. Right, just good, totally gone. So gone from all the zoos. Or conservation centers or whatever it is. Extirpated is locally extinct. So the animal itself isn't extinct, not at all. It might be like threatened or near threatened or something. But locally, it's no longer part of its historic range. It's totally gone from there with no hopes of coming back. Which is essentially what we did to bison in the Midwest and in the East, right? There's no bison that's just gonna like hang out there anymore. They're gone. Okay. And there's like, used to be major elk populations and such in Wisconsin and Minnesota, and they're gone. There's some elk in Pennsylvania. There's elk here in the West, and then that's pretty much it. Okay. We'll talk more about the field trips and stuff next week, but remember, we'll plan to meet on Sundays just here in this parking lot. It's easy for everybody to find, so might as well just go to the R9 here at 8 a.m. And then we'll get everybody made. It'll probably take like a half hour or something to load everything up for everybody, make sure we have everything. Make sure everybody is with us, so we don't leave somebody behind. Holding Baxter left me behind on a field trip one time. It's a whole thing. He looked right at me. Gonna go get those waiters? Yes, I'm going to get the waiters. Okay. All right, I'm gonna run to my car and get them. All right. Come back, he's driving. I called him old man from home. It's not even old, he's like in his mid-40s. Okay. There is a short reading assignment for weeks 3 that we'll get into. I'll get into that later. These are just review of things you'll need to know, right? These are the dates. These will be important to you. I will ask them to you on your first exam, on your midterm. For sure, right? And so hopefully they are items in which will help you get into the exam. You know these, right? And so the first 10 or whatever questions you're confident you know, you can kind of get on a roll when you're doing the exam. All right, review. These are the three extinction events you're worried about in here. KT, Permian, Pleistocene. And KT and Permian were worldwide. Pleistocene was mostly worldwide, but Africa was mostly ignored. I don't want to say ignored. That makes it seem like the extinction had a plan. That's not true. It was, what's the word? Untouched. Yeah. Yeah, it avoided it. Here's Earth. Here's the biogeographical realms again. Okay, these will be important as we get into like the second third of the class. The first third is like, what are mammals? Like the history of mammals, synapsids, so on. The body plan of the mammal, reproduction of mammals, that kind of thing. Then we kind of are delving off into like, these are the different orders that exist. These are the different families, and we're going to talk about each one as we go through it, kind of thing, okay? This will be incredibly important as we get to that, right? Because you'll see certain animals exist only in like the Afrotropical area, kind of thing, right? So, okay. Here is something that was mentioned last time, right? The Wallace line. It cuts through Indonesia there, not far away from Jakarta, if you know that's the capital of Indonesia. And goes up towards the Philippines and is separating like Papua New Guinea and most of Indonesia from like Singapore and so on. It's the line that Alfred Russel Wallace was working on and said, all right, for whatever reason, here is like a cutoff that exists. There are certain species above this line and certain species below this line. and they do not intermix. Even though they're, in his case, birds again. And they could just fly. They could just fly over there. But they just don't. So there's something about the difference in the island ecosystems and environments that are there that causes this to happen, right? It's not hard for you to really envision it. There's an idea called island biogeography. You all have taken ecology, yes? You've heard of island biogeography? Okay, I don't know how in depth you guys went over it there. When I took it, it was like mentioned and then kind of implemented, right? The idea of island biogeography is that you have a species that's very agile or mobile that's coming from a continent and that is slowly radiating outward with like the wind or ocean currents and tides because it can carry them further. In the case of mammals, it's pretty much that most of the time. Certain mammals like bears can swim pretty far, actually. Like a polar bear can swim for like 15, 20 miles. They're actually very good, right? They swim better than us, but they can't go forever. They need some place to stop. So for a polar bear, that's ice, but in the oceans, it could just be little islands that are populated by plant species that are like, that's where things start. Then you get little insects, then you build up from there to small vertebrates, and then on you go, right? And as that happens, it's an island. So it's relatively isolated from most things, right? It's not like the mainland continent where, all right, some areas are pretty hard to get to, but you can get to them, right? There's like a physical barrier. If you, let's just say it's you and you are on the tip of Vietnam, there's a ton of islands around Vietnam. You can see them from the shore. But you have everything you need on the island. Do you have any reason to like want to just go there? It's us, so kind of, because we have the ability to be like, well, what's over there? I kind of wonder. But if you put yourself in just like a normal mammal position, right? You know, not us. If everything, all your needs are met, you have all your food, everything like that, you're not in danger. Are you just gonna like go over there? No, right? There's no reason. You have to be forced in that way. And that's what island biogeography kind of is hinting at. And that's what Wallace was nailing. Okay, this is it in a little bit more detail. It's a little bit more clear. It's showing you like, all right, here's Borneo, Sumatra, Java. Any of your big coffee drinkers, this is where some of your coffee is coming from. Okay. If we're looking at mammals, you might ask yourself, the first question is, what is a mammal? We kind of covered that already. And the traits that all mammals have, the 3 ear bones, inner ear bones, right? Jaw, the dentary that's there, mammary glands, so forth. But then you might ask, you know, where is this like starting? Where did mammals come from? People were talking about fish ecology earlier. And the frustrating definition that people run into in biology for taxonomy and systematics in particular is that in a lot of ways, some things aren't necessarily like super well defined. It's just the further you get down the taxonomic tree, the less like defined traits that thing has. So everything above it fits into that definition. Which is weird for us to think about because we created the species concept in order to try to make sense of the world. We created taxonomy to try to like make sense of what's going on, right? Who's to say that a robin or a fox squirrel is different from a red squirrel? Are they different? Yes, we know they're different. You can analyze their genetic code. They're definitely different. But like, does that matter at all? Really? Like, we're just like assigning importance to those kind of things, right? And we're doing that because we want to try to figure out what's around us because chaos is uncomfortable. And so you try to create order out of chaos. is essentially what's happening, right? Like that's what the entire idea was, what it spawned from. And so, mammals and any other tetrapod, for that matter, gets its roots here, at coleanths. Anybody ever heard of coleanths before? Yeah, most of you? All right, what is a coleanth then? Lobe-finned fish. It was thought, well, all right, let me back up. It was identified, I believe, in the early 1800s, early 19th century. And it was thought to be extinct, okay? Our first attempts at putting together skeletons and articulating them, you should look some of those up. They're hilarious. They're not even remotely close. And it's like, just hilarious to look at, but at the same time, it was the first people ever trying to do this, and they had no idea what these animals looked like. Evolution wasn't really solidified as an idea yet. And they didn't know if they had all the parts to that animal, right? We now know that a lot of times a femur could be missing, or a rib could be missing, or vertebrae could be missing, right? Because I don't know, whatever else scavenged it when the animal died and it just went on, right? So that's common. But they didn't know that at the time. So while it's funny to look at and it is hilarious to see, you kind of have to respect the effort for them to even attempt to start doing it when they had no idea what they were doing. Right? At least they were trying. We identified these and had a decent idea in the early 1800s of what these guys were. How were they different from other fish? They're lobe-finned fish, but like what makes them different than? They're still fish. Still looks like a fish, right? So what's different about them?
These would sort of have articulated jaws, don't they?
They have articulated jaws as one. What's the big thing about them? That's like majorly different. Their fins are different. So down here, particularly right in here, this is much different, right? If you just like look at a fish, like a bass or a trout or something, it doesn't have a fin that just like comes off the side of it that looks like a wrist, right? This looks like there's bone jutting out the side of it because there is, right? They just have fins that attach right to the trunk of the body and that they can control. This is something different, right? So inside your wrist, you don't need to know the bones, but the group, your carpals right here are called seismoid bones. Just little irregular bones that are about the same width as they are long, lengthwise, and all this and the other, right? They're what allow you to articulate your wrist in a bunch of different directions and be fine, right? These guys have that same thing. What does that allow them to do that's different from other fish? Allows them to easily walk on the bottom of the ocean itself. That is the precursor to what? Walking on land. It's the precursor to being a tetrapod. Fish aren't tetrapods. We're tetrapods, though. We have 4 limbs. This is the beginning of that. All comes from a coleanth. They were thought extinct right up until about World War I, or until World War II, I'm sorry. And then there was a woman that was doing her PhD. I think she was English, if I remember correctly. And she was traveling in South Africa. She was at a fish market in South Africa. And then came across one of these just sitting there at the market that you could buy to take home and eat. And she was like, thought these were extinct. Because no one like thought they hadn't been found in the ocean anywhere up until that point that Western science knew of, right? That the people that were studying these knew of. And so we just thought they were extinct. Science did. But the locals that lived there knew they weren't extinct all along, right? Like they knew where they were, they knew there was a giant population there. They just didn't say anything. Which I respect. Because what happens as soon as you say something? Now it's like the site of extreme, research, which is good, but it's also an extreme, like, site of extreme popularity. Everyone's going there, everyone's disturbing it. Now people are messing up your fish market. This is like your livelihood and like it's getting affected, right? So I don't blame them. I wouldn't have said anything either. But she finds out that these things exist, and they exist in between the Cape of South Africa and Madagascar, whole population. And in fact, they're still there. They're still alive down there today. And instead of using gas, they have oil in their swim bladder, which obviously is heavier, it's more dense, and it allows them to stay on the bottom easier. So their pectoral fin right here, and their pelvic fin, and their anal fin have essentially what would be like your wrist and ankles in there, in order for them to be able to move around the rocky bottom. We'll get on it a little bit later, but there are tetrapods that exist that you wouldn't necessarily think are tetrapods, right? And this is, yeah, good.
Quick question about the Wallace line. Is there a reason he drew it right there? Like, is it on like the tectonic plate lines or?
It's not on the tectonic plate line. But this is like the,
Oh, just like the observable boundary you found?
yeah. So it's like, this is the observable boundary. There's different species here versus here. Different here in the Philippines versus the top of Papua New Guinea. There's a lot of, you know what birds of paradise are? The whole group. There's different species that exist here versus here. They don't interact. Okay, as I alluded to though, everything that came, like, here's tetrapods, everything that comes after that is a tetrapod. Regardless of the fact that some of them no longer have limbs. That you would think of. Any idea what that would be? An example in mammalogy? What would be a mammal example?
Dolphins and whales?
Dolphins and whales fit into that. They have flippers on a tail, but they don't have 4 limbs. Tetra means 4, right? That's what tetra means. But they're still a tetrapod. Okay? Are you good with that? We'll talk about how and why that happened. That was one of the biggest finds in biology within the last 30 years. There was a whole subset that we thought whales and dolphins were their own thing entirely. And so they were off on the side on a tree. Turns out that they just descend from hippos.
The discovery of the Pachycetus, wasn't it?
Yeah. And so they just, you know, you get a hippo that's semi-aquatic and you get an animal that just goes from there, returns to the ocean entirely. Okay. Here is an example of low-fin fish versus an early amphibian.
I gotta hear more about this hippo thing.
We'll get on it later. There'll be a whole section on it. It'll be a whole thing. It'll be like a month or so from now, but it'll be a whole thing.
I'll be patient.
Yeah. Okay. Low-fin fish versus early amphibian. Not a mammal yet, of course, not even an amnio, but a step towards getting to mammals. Yeah. You can see that, all right, this is starting to look kind of familiar now, right? Like, it's not quite us, but it's definitely more us than this, right? And so we're just going along that line. You're starting to create a pelvic girdle. You're starting to create a femur and a tibia, right? You're starting to create a humerus and a radius and ulna. Okay. Here is something that's increasingly amphibian-like. It's not an amphibian yet, but it's also not a fish. Right? Well, okay, it is a fish technically. But not what we would, in just layman's terms, colloquially say is a fish, right? So it's not that, but it's also not an amphibian. So it's like in the middle somewhere. And we're gonna talk a lot about things that fit that bill, especially in this class, things like civets. If you know what a civet is. It's not a cat, it's not a dog, it's not a fox that is like a dog with cat software. It's like just its own thing in there that looks familiar, but also doesn't look familiar at the same time. It's like this weird intermediary. And they also make really expensive coffee that they poop out. Civet coffee's like $100 for a bag of it. I want to try it really bad, but I don't want to spend $100 on civet poop coffee. Do it.
These are biology class fee for that.
I think that would be looked at. I'll have to ask Dave. He's had it before. All right, here's lungfish. There's 3 genera of lungfish that exist, 6 species. They're relatively rare, of course. I'd have to ask Keely to know where all of them live, but I think most of them live in like Central Africa, Savannah, Central Africa kind of areas. What's different about them? One, they obviously use actual lungs, right? Just like us. They inflate and they pass oxygen and CO2 over an alveolar sac in their lungs to diffuse, just like we do, versus over gills. That's not to say they don't have gills, they do, but it allows them to subsist when the dry season comes, essentially, right? This adaptation is such that, like, I don't know how much you know about lungfish, but there's no reason you know anything about lungfish unless you just wanted to. Essentially, the savanna has wet and dry seasons, right? You're probably familiar with that. During the dry season, it gets like bone dry in some places, right? I mean, you can't find water for kilometers, many kilometers. But if you dig down where there was an ephemeral river or pond or something, it still sometimes can be muddy or moist. So you can have lungfish that exist there. They have like used their lobe fins to dig down into the mud and soil and create like a little den area. And they stay moist by doing that. And then they just breathe the air with their lungs and wait for the wet season to come back. Which is pretty cool. Wrong here. Okay. If you go a little bit further, this is what one looks like. Relatively cool. Almost looks like an eel to me, right? It's pretty similar looking. Cool animal. All right. What else do you have about a lungfish that's a little bit different though? It has a modified swim bladder in order to allow it to do these things. It can sink a little bit easier as a result, which again, since it has modified limbs, allows it to like walk on the bottom of, bottom of the river or pond or lake or whatever. Not ocean, I almost said ocean. Definitely not that. Okay. If you look and dissect one, you get a mid-sagittal section. You're gonna have at the top there, notochord. Do you know how a notochord and a spinal cord are different? Yeah, it's not encapsulated in a protective ossified bone. Right, so all of us have a spinal cord. Right, it's a thick, very thick piece of nervous tissue with millions of neurons running down it that is specifically protected by vertebrae, right? Even if you fall on your back from 10 feet up, okay, you're gonna crush some vertebrae, probably. But that doesn't necessitate your actual spinal cord itself having damage, right? It may or may not, but the chance that it has damage is a lot lower than if you didn't have any surrounding at all and you just plopped, right? That would be much worse. Notochords don't have that. They might have, like, depending on the animal, depending on the species, they might have like some softer cartilage around it, like hyaline cartilage. Anyone in here take A&P? No reason. I don't think any of you have A&P as a requirement, so, yeah. There's hyaline cartilage, which is like your mediastinum right here. And like the end of your nose kind of thing, this easy to move around, but it has structure kind of thing. Could be covered in that, but it's not encapsulated in hard ossified bone. Okay. This is used as an evolutionary tracker. Like when you're talking about something, it's been argued about whether or not this is proper to use, because it gives the wrong connotation a lot of the times. But it's still common to use nonetheless. You would refer to something as more derived or more primitive. You know what I'm talking about? You ever heard that? When something is more primitive, it's further down the taxonomic tree and is what is considered as a less complex animal or organism in general, right? And then the more derived it is, the much more specialized it is at whatever that thing is. Primates would be opposable thumbs and toes, right? We would have hair, large brains, so on. We're specialized in that. So it's just how far along something is in its evolutionary tree track kind of thing. And a notochord is considered more primitive than a spinal cord, for example. Okay. Then you can also see its left lung right there. Is that really hard to see because of the lights or no? Can you turn off the front row? The lights, you got the switch right there. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. I mean, it's better for me from right here. It has to be better back there. Okay. So, recap real quick. Understand the sequence that's going on. You have 4 limbs required to be a tetrapod, right? At least at some point in the evolutionary tree. That doesn't mean 4 limbs right now is required, but one of your common ancestors had to have 4 limbs. And it's a straight requirement, right? Like a snake is a tetrapod, right? Because snakes are reptiles, proto-reptiles all were tetrapods. So snake is a tetrapod. Dolphin is a tetrapod. Whale is a tetrapod. So, okay. Lungs of tetrapod likely arose from a swim bladder. And so you start with a coleant that has oil in a swim bladder. It's really primitive. They still exist. They still use it. Oil is more dense and therefore allows them to sink. The lungfish is starting to like get away from that slowly, right? And so there's some species you can get to now. You look at it and it'll be markedly different from like a trout or a bass or, you know, a pike or whatever. But it'll be filled mostly with gas, right? So you're getting from, all right, here's low fin fish with a swim bladder filled with oil that allows it to walk on water. And then you have lungfish that has muscular limbs as well as it being bony. Right, so it's got some bone in there, but it's also more muscular at the same time. And then their swim bladders moving towards the more derived state of what you would typically see in most fishes today. Which then is making the shift of them breathing air as well. And then from there you get to amphibians, right? Or proto-amphibians. This is not an amnion animal yet. It still needs water to survive. It still needs water to reproduce. If it's outside of that, it's not reproducing. Even if it's at least a small amount, right? then they can reproduce, like. How does a Amazonian tree frog reproduce? It needs water still, right? But it's they're tiny little frogs, right? And they can reproduce in a puddle one, for example. Right, so yes, they're that far inland, but at least there's still a water source they have to have. Okay. That is the marker of amphibians essentially, right? They breathe air. They're a tetrapod now, but they're not an amniote. They have to return to water. Okay. From there, though, you get something that is more akin to be what you could call like a proto-reptile, right? It's not a reptile yet. It's not an amphibian though either. This thing starts to have, well, it's a tiktaalik, by the way. It starts to have 4 well-defined limbs, an actual like easily identifiable tetrapod. Then, as well as that, it has 5 digits on each of its limbs, which is relatively familiar to us, yeah. Okay. And it can go on land, it's fine on land, it spends most of its life on land. Doesn't mean it doesn't go to the water or anything, it's still tied there for reproduction because it's not quite a reptile yet, but you're getting closer to that. And so these things are moving in incredibly small steps, right? You got one thing that'll, lobe-finned fish that'll last for hundreds of thousands of years. Then you slowly, over that time, go to a lungfish that lasts for hundreds of thousands or millions of years. Then you go a little bit forward to the early amphibian, hundreds of thousands or millions of years. Then you're moving a little bit forward. So you're just coming like a hair at a time, right? So major thing here is well-defined limbs, and you're getting 5 digits on the end of each of those limbs. That's like a major thing, right? How often, and you can think of it yourself, how often have you like, I don't know, been walking down a trail or anything, anywhere at all, and been like slightly off balance? And then you can like just curl your toes and like catch yourself, right? That kind of thing is huge. You don't think of it that much. It's just something you do. But if you didn't have 5 digits on your foot, you would have just fallen over, right? So having 5 limbs on the end of it, the end of the limb is actually gigantic. That's a big deal. And it's a big deal because it allows this animal to then interact way differently with the environment around it. Right? It can climb up things that it previously was not able to do so. Plants have existed around it. It would be really good if you can get up this rock or whatever to get to like the fruit of the plant, or well, at that time it wouldn't have been a fruited plant. It would have been a farm, but still, you get the idea. Okay. However, still tied to water for reproduction, not in animal yet. About 320 million years ago, though, is when you start seeing modern amphibians. Okay, it's like the things you would recognize as the most primitive amphibian that we see today. Gnathosomes are tetrapods, 4 limbs, and this is what's transitioning onto land. And you get like the ability to become an amniote from this. Your vertebral column lengthens a little bit. You can start developing a tail as well for balance. You wouldn't really have needed one when you were an early reptile or an early amphibian, sorry. Because you're still primarily in water and you have your like thin like limbs-ish that are somewhere in between. You can use those for probably yourself. But now you start seeing stuff like that. You're primarily using your limbs for locomotion and reproduction. And Well, I don't want to get ahead of it. I'll stop there. Let's see, what time is it? Only a few minutes left. Before I go on, any questions? Any at all?
Relevant questions or just questions?
Or is it just questions?
Well, I think I'm good.
Sure.
Yeah, she's right. I'm so stuck on the hippo to dolphin sequence.
Okay. Anybody else?
So, I've heard the pronunciation, coelacanth.
See the camp, yeah,
Yeah, what is that coelacanth is the?
yes, it's coelacanth, that's right, yeah. One thing you'll learn over time is my brain will get ahead. And I'll just say it wrong. Did I not say coelacanth before?
You said coelacanth or something.
Oh my god. Yeah, it's definitely coelacanth,
Yeah.
for sure, it's coelacanth.
Coelacanth.
Oh my.
It was weird.
And I was like, oh, maybe I didn't think that.
No, it's coelacanth.
I thought it was.
At any point, feel free to just be like, no. The first time I was teaching A and P, I was calling the joint where your femur goes in, and see the bell. It's acetabulum. It's definitely acetabulum. But like my brain just doesn't work sometimes.
Yeah.
You know? And I just, like, I don't know. I don't have ADHD, but sometimes I think I do. And it's just like I have not had enough caffeine to deal with this. I don't know. And it becomes a problem.
Is it just like dyslexia?
No, well, both of my brothers had dyslexia. I was never tested for it. So.
Oh, no, who said that?
I don't know. I think I'm just dumb.
I'm the best of it, right?
What?
That's the best of it. I do it too.
Yeah.
Yesterday, I meant to say like cold and I said hot.
Well, in physics, there's no such thing as cold. So.
It's very, very.
So what?
Don't remind me about physics,
Yeah.
I'm taking that this semester, I don't want to.
Don't remind me, I'm done.
Physics is great.
Yeah,
All right, last thing I'll say, because we only got a minute. Vertebral column, when you get here, is strengthened a lot. What does that do for us?
Allows us to support our own weight.
Allows us to support our own weight, and then does what else? Before you had a very, very like thin vertebral column. Think of, I don't know, you ever had a pin bone in a fish that didn't get taken out? You can easily grind in your teeth, but it's uncomfortable, right? Like it's not great. That's kind of like the thickness of the vertebrae we're talking about here. Is that any good? I mean, it's fine for the water because you're being supported by the buoyancy of the water, right? So like, no big deal. If you're no longer in the water, then what's the problem with that? Yeah, sheer gravity will act down on you, right? I mean, I don't know if you know this, but if you measure yourself right when you wake up and then do it again, right before you go to bed, you'll be short because of gravity. That's a real thing that happens. So if you were a tetrapod on 4 limbs and you had thin vertebrae like that and gravity's pushing down, that's not great. And that's not particularly good. It's not useful. So you ossify your vertebrae. What that also does is allow you to start developing an actual spinal cord versus a notochord, which is also obviously a really big deal. Okay, and then you start getting thick shoulder and like a pelvic girdle. Why would you get those? Because those are the connection points for the tetrapod, right? Those are the limb connection points. Here you're having large ball socket joints to allow the freedom of movement. Okay. All right. See you Friday. Let me know if you have questions. I'm gonna be upstairs for a little while after this, so feel free to come bother me.